Hi, this is Emily Freitag, and I'm delighted today to be joined by Dr. Robert Berry, who is Professor of Mathematics Education at University of Virginia and immediate past president of NCTM. Dr. Berry, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
As we start all of these interviews, we'd love to start by hearing a little bit about your personal learning journey and what that has taught you about learning.
Great. I would like to say there's this kind of grandiose story or something exciting, but actually, I grew up in Hampton, Virginia, and Hampton is on the, in the Tidewater area of Virginia. And so I went to school there, primarily K-12. I would say my experience, so I would say this, when I was younger, I had the benefit of kind of learning my multiplication tables quicker than other kids. And so that perception put me in kind of when you think about a tracking system in the elementary grades, put me in kind of the high group, so to speak. But there was some insecurities. When I say that, some insecurities, I would say I was the kind of student that was kind of in the middle, didn't cause any trouble, pretty compliant, very much I would describe it as the kind of forgotten kid. Not gonna cause any trouble, kind of do my work, I kind of follow the rules, really, so I mean, up until, I would say that my primary K-12 experience, but in high school I would say I had an experience where I was taking analytical geometry, and I wish, so it had a little kind of trig in it, and it's kind of out after algebra 2, and so it's kind of just had some algebra 2 and trig. So it's an interesting course because I don't see that course listed hardly anywhere now these days. But it was one of those, that course, I can remember the teacher's name because it had a significant impact. Her name was Mrs. Warden, and it was her first year teaching. So that was interesting in and of itself. And, I can't remember all the circumstances, but, I didn't do all my work in that class. And in fact, I got to a point where I essentially gave up. But, towards the end of the year, Mrs. Warden approached me and asked. I mean, she thought I could do better, but I just didn't try. I didn't. And we actually made a deal. She said, if I get an A on every quiz and test the last 9 weeks of school, this was before high stakes testing, so, that I could get an A in the class. And I ended up doing it. So that was an interesting motivator. I ended up doing that and doing well in that class. And it's just, as I reflect on that, I don't know why I wasn't motivated up to that point. Maybe I was bored with school or something of that sort, but I wasn't as motivated. So it was those kinds of, I would say, people along my trajectory who provided support, inspiration. Even as I moved through undergraduate and on to graduate school, there were key people along my journey who were quite influential and provided me the kinds of support. So for me, it's relationships.
Yeah.
And that's a part of my own kind of work when I think about that. Too often I say we teach more than math. We teach people. And sometimes as math educators, we focus on the content area, but not the human aspects of our work. And I'm not trying to overgeneralize that, but I do think that we teach people, and in doing that, we have to forge the relationships necessary so that people are willing. For many, for some students, it might be taking a risk. And when I say taking a risk, how do we create the social and emotional spaces in our classroom so that students will be willing to take the kinds of risks that we hope they would take? When I say taking risks, sharing their problem solving strategy, sharing their thinking, being verbal for many students is a risk taking event. and and I think we have to develop an appreciation for when students put themselves out there, so to speak, that for many that might be the risk that they're taking. And how do we support and nurture that so that they're willing to continue to take those risks along the way? So yeah, much my relationships are big for me. And so even on through undergrad, interestingly, I had a relationship with faculty member on through my master's degree. My advisor, she was I would say my biggest supporter. She saw things in me that I didn't see in myself as a teacher. And even when I worked on my master's degree, I was teaching at the same time. And really encouraged me to move on to do a doctorate. I mean, my initial reason for getting a master's degree was it puts me on a different pay scale so I can make more money. I mean, it was real.
Yeah.
All the other stuff, I just need to be on this pay scale and not this pay scale.
Yeah.
But what happened is, my master's thesis won an award, got some recognition. My advisor saw things, she really encouraged me to move forward. She then introduced me to Carol Malloy, who became my advisor when I did my doctorate at the University of North Carolina. And I can't say enough about Dr. Malloy and the kind of support not only she provide for myself, but her impact on math education as a field. And there are a lot of us. What I said, there are several Carol Malloy students out there in the field who are doing phenomenal work. And so, I think there's this kind of feeling or collective feeling that many of us have about her. Not only are those of us who were her students, but those of us. So when I was at Carolina, Dr. Malloy was on the board of NCTM. And being on the board of NCTM, I had always been an NCTM member. I've been an NCTM member when I first started teaching, but I did not.
Me too. I think I was 4 months in and discovered it. And yes.
Yeah. So I've always been a member, but I'd not known, okay, how does, becoming a volunteer and working with the leadership structure and things of that nature, not. So having to see that firsthand. And I think one of probably, from Dr. Malloy's perspective, one of her biggest, so the year I got elected to the NCTM Board of Directors, Mark Ellis got elected. And the common thing that Mark and I shared, that we both went to Carolina, we both were Carol's students. And she was so pleased that she had 2 of her students on the Board of Directors of NCTM.
It's a great story. I think relationships and the impact and the relationship between relationships and content has just been the dominant theme of these conversations. Well, take us into your research, your leadership experience, your kind of history. And, we are exploring the question in this series about what do we know works in the job of supporting and advancing, maybe even accelerating student learning, that we can anchor on as students with exacerbated inequities and greater unfinished learning come back to school.
Great. So I think there are a couple of things as I think about the work that I'm kind of doing now, and the work I did when I was a classroom teacher. So I taught Newport News, Virginia. for a number of years, and if Newport News and Hampton are bordering cities in Tidewater. So essentially, I was back home, so to speak. So most of my career, I taught Newport News, Virginia. But I bring that up as a point. I had the unique experience of teaching a group of kids for 3 consecutive years. I
Oh,
looped
that
with
is interesting.
I loop with them, and as a researcher and looking back on that now, what affordances did I have in having that experience? Several things happened. I didn't have to, kind of develop relationships. So I was this group of kids: 5th grade teacher, the 6th grade teacher, and the 7th grade teacher.
Wow. all mathematics, or was this a
math? So when I taught 5th grade, I taught math and science.
Okay.
And then 6th grade, it was just math, and then 7th grade was math.
So interesting.
So I was in a K-8 school at the time, and so that experience of the relationships I developed with the students, the relationship, more importantly, I developed with their parents, was significant. So the school I taught at was Dunbar-Irwin, and Dunbar-Irwin is a school that's downtown Newport News, high risk population, in proximity to public housing. But it is those relationships that I developed with those students, and not only the relationships, so we had a way of kind of interacting with each other. And so there was a kinship there. So when I think about that experience as a classroom teacher, and then thinking about my own research, so at the University of North Carolina, my dissertation focused on the voices of Black boys who have been successful with school mathematics. And the way I defined success was based on course enrollment patterns. And so at the time, I focused on Black boys who were in Algebra 1 or geometry in middle school. And so it was a qualitative study. And the things I want to kind of get at is trying to figure out or understand their experiences. And so just kind of broadly in time, I'll tell one story. So one of the kids in the story, he 6th grade, he took 6th grade math. He wasn't performing at the level which he was performing. He typically performed all through elementary school. He made A's and B's. So he was just a really high performer. 6th grade transition from elementary to middle school and just was not performing where he typically performed. And so what happened, it was recommended that he be switched from his, advanced math course and moved down to a lower course. So he was, it wasn't that he was failing 6th grade math. He was just making C's, he just kind of doing this, I won't say doing this thing, but kind of just not doing what he had typically done in the past. But this recommendation came odd to the parents in the sense that while he wasn't failing, it was just kind of, the focus on was not providing him additional support so that he can be as successful as he once was. The focus was on removing him
from the class.
And that impact, what impact would that have had on him kind of moving forward? And I tell that story because this story occurred before he was a participant in my study, but that resonated with the parents in such a way that they speculated all the things that could have happened, how his trajectory would have been different, and things of that sort. And so I bring that story up because as I began to interview and talk with more of the boys, I had 8 participants in my study. 5 of the 8 had similar types of stories. There were nuances that made them different, but when you look at the kind of some type of focus to move them away. But the other common thing that these boys had that I shared with them as well is that sometime in 3rd or 4th grade, they realized they were smart at math when they thought they knew their multiplication tables before all the other kids did. And so
That is so, and that maps to your story too.
it maps right to my story. And so that is so interesting in the sense that
What is it about those multiplication facts, Dr. Barry? I mean, they're so emotional.
They are, and I think as a field, we give those facts high status for some reason. They serve as a filter to determine whether kids can or cannot do mathematics, when we know that is not necessarily true.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that whole idea, and I'm not implying that we don't want kids to know fluency, not know their facts. What I am implying is the kind of the timed automaticity that's been that was my experience and others. Although I was successful at it, and these boys were successful at it, it gave them kind of this entry point. But what about the other kids who were not successful at it, but could have just done the math and could have performed really well? I guess so.
It is so interesting. I mean, it's an identity. It becomes an identity.
It certainly does. And I wonder,
which becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, right?
So I wonder how that moment in third or fourth grade, what impact does that have on the student's identity mathematically going forward? And how do we disrupt that? Because I think that status of multiplication, knowing the multiplication tables with some level of automaticity so young, it is can be problematic. And I experienced that as a parent as well. I mean, so my youngest son, he didn't know them fast like a timetable, but the experience that, my wife's a math teacher and I do what I do. So, but what he did know is he knew how to decompose numbers and figure it out. So when you did a 3 minute, whatever the mad minute, he just didn't perform well. But if you ask him what 7 times 7 is, he probably decomposed it to 7 times 5 and 7 times 2, because he knew it was 5 and 2 facts and put them together. And so, but the time part,
which probably actually served him better when he got to algebra, right? Like
exactly. So the time part is given so much status, which is problematic in many ways. And we have to figure out how to disrupt that. Because we want thinkers. We want thinkers and we want doers. And how do we construct that experience with this?
So I'm hearing a good what not to do lesson in this. What we know doesn't work is labeling students based on one aspect of what they know or don't know or can do or can't do yet, in a way that really harms their identity forever.
Right.
What do we know works? Like, as teachers prepare for the idea of students coming in with significantly increased unfinished learning, what can we lean on that we do know?
Great. So I think there are a couple of things I think we can lean on. One of the things I think we can do is create spaces and opportunities for students to kind of discuss their ways of knowing and thinking about mathematics. And once we know what they know, how do we then provide the kind of supports? I'm hesitant to use the term intervention, but I do want to say the kind of supports for that, because what they know is what they know. And sometimes it overlaps with what we want them to know. And that's a whole different conversation. But what they know is what they know. And so it is.
Can I take you back for 1 second to ask why you're hesitant about the word intervention?
So because intervention sometimes is very broad. And so when I think of intervention, you're intervening for. So if I'm intervening for a purpose that might fit my need or the curriculum need or something else, and maybe sometimes it's not necessarily for the students' need and the ways of knowing. And not to imply the intervention in a deficit way, but just kind of saying, first of all, what are supports? And then You know, if the goal is for student to meet a benchmark, they're not
Mm-hmm.
met that, then we can do some type of intervention.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't want the framing to be positioned as intervene or have some type of intervention up front without
Mm-hmm.
knowing what kinds of resources that students bring to the experience.
Mm-hmm.
And knowing and
Thank you.
understanding those resources is significant.
Mm-hmm.
Because too often what happens is we focus on what they don't know. So therefore I need to do some type of intervention so they can learn what they don't know.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
I want to focus on what they do know and
Mm-hmm.
how do we support them to kind of move forward and create the space for them to have the efficacy and the motivation to continue their learning.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, and um, and so it is. So what is it that you want to know more about? And that's kind of the question that one
Mm-hmm.
might pose. So what is it? So the question might be, and what mathematics do you think you need to know? And they may not have the vocabulary that's associated to describe the math they
Mm-hmm.
need to know, but to like, I need to be able to do the X, Y, Z, or something like this. And then
Mm-hmm.
as a professional, I can begin to have conversations and questions about that to begin to understand, okay, this is how we can create a structure for them that
Mm-hmm.
might be motivating for them to understand. So I want to make the distinction between intervention and support
Yeah.
as I'm using it in this case.
Helpful.
And I forgot what I was going to say, so
I
I'll
know,
ask
I
another
know.
question.
Well, okay, I thank you for that clarification because it's a word that's actually very loaded. So
Right.
I was grateful to hear more. Um, so what do we know works? You were saying creating space for mathematical conversations.
I think discourse is important. Those who
Mm-hmm.
position, so those who get to speak in math classrooms are often positioned as being competent.
Mm.
And how do we create more space for students to engage in discourse? And I don't want to advantage discourse as a verbal thing. Discourse can be not only verbal, but it also can be other kinds of representation where students communicate their mathematical idea. So it can be
Mm-hmm.
pictures, it can be drawings, it can be
Mm-hmm.
even demonstration using manipulatives and tools
Mm-hmm.
and things of that sort. And so we want to, and one might call those representation. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to argue discourse is a form of representation, but it's a distinct form of representation. But
Mm-hmm.
nonetheless, all of those other things that fit under
Mm-hmm.
representation, I'm going to argue is also can be a form of discourse in the sense
Mm-hmm.
that um, as a professional and I see students performing using a manipulative or tool, I want to then figure out how they're making sense of it. And the way that we do it is to have that. Now we
Mm-hmm.
then tag the verbal part to the performative part.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so, so I do think, this idea of competency and authority comes into play as well. So how do we position students as being competent? We create space for them to demonstrate their understanding about that. And that demonstration can be about, um, you know, you know, through questioning, through all kinds of modes of discourse. It could be instructional routines that we did. And so
Mm-hmm.
one of the instructional routines I like, um, uh, um, that I often sometimes do is notice and wonder, which is very
Mm-hmm.
popular. A lot
Yep.
of people do notice and wonder. But what notice and wonder do, it lowers the perception of taking a risk because all
Mm-hmm.
kids can notice.
Mm-hmm.
So what do you notice about this?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, there's a six. Oh, okay.
Mm-hmm.
Wonder what that six means. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
so all kids can notice, all
Mm-hmm.
kids can wonder, and when we do that, we have entry point to how they're thinking about, or what is it that they see, how they're thinking about things,
Mm-hmm.
what they are attuned to and what they're not attuned to. That is
Mm-hmm.
valuable information for me as a teacher
Mm-hmm.
to kind of figure out rather than have them perform a task and either you're right or wrong. I don't have any more
Mm-hmm.
information to determine how you understood or even how you interpret the task. Your
Mm-hmm.
interpretation of the task might be different from my intention of the task.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
and so I think that is, um, so the idea, but so then I mentioned authority earlier. Too often students don't get I find that too often students do not have maximum opportunity to author their own ideas.
Hmm. Mm-hmm.
When I say author their own ideas, you know, so um, so an example I've seen of this, where I actually saw a pre-K teacher do this. It was a task that they were working on, and basically it was, I'm going to characterize the task as a word problem task.
Mm-hmm.
And she basically said, you know, I don't really like this. I wonder what can we change this whole story? and then changing the story. But now I want some numbers in this, or you know, she
Mm-hmm.
began to try to move towards mathematizing it. So
Mm-hmm.
students author ideas, they mathematize the ideas. Now they engage in the mathematics, and
Mm-hmm.
there's sort of like this collective buy-in around
Mm-hmm.
these ideas. So you know, and so I mean that's one example, but just
Mm-hmm.
offering ideas, which then connects highly to discourse, right?
Mm-hmm.
so
Mm-hmm.
so
Mm-hmm.
it is a, but the author discourse might be talking about something. Authoring ideas might be creating, make them problem posers.
Yeah.
And so
I have a follow-up question on that.
okay.
Because as you are talking, I am thinking, I just find myself thinking about pedagogical content knowledge
Hmm.
and just how much it requires. And so can you tell us a little bit about what you have learned about how to equip teachers
Right.
with the pedagogical content knowledge that allows then the comfort
Yeah.
in facilitating this approach to instruction?
Yeah. You know, it makes me think. I often say I wish I could go back and do some things again when I was a classroom teacher, because I'm so much better now.
Yes, yes.
But I don't want to imply that, you know, that my younger self wasn't, you know, not in it, wasn't effective. But you know,
Yeah.
I think the flexibility in thinking and the instructional routines I've had. So I think one of the things with pedagogical content knowledge, it there are a couple of things at play. I mean, so knowledge of students, knowledge of curriculum, and all those things are at play. But
Mm-hmm.
the other thing that comes with that, it reminds me of kind of Peg Smith's work around the 5 practices,
Mm-hmm.
and anticipating students thinking. When you think about,
Mm-hmm.
you know, kind of productive discourse,
Mm-hmm.
um, you know, I think some advantages that a more experienced teacher may have over a novice teacher is that as the students are engaging in tasks, you can, in the planning of the task, you might be able to anticipate some
Yeah.
some level of range of ideas that students may come forward. And so
Mm-hmm.
that idea, but the thing that ties it to pedagogical content knowledge is, what is the follow-up question, or what is the follow-up, or how do I impact or think about students' representation around those ideas,
Mm-hmm.
and so it's understanding students thinking about mathematics, and so to me that's a high metacognitive load that teachers carry.
Mm-hmm.
Deborah Ball talks about this all the time, the kinds of
Mm-hmm.
questions, all of the
Yeah.
decisions that teachers make in the moment, and throughout a lesson, um, you know, they're hardly, I mean, it could be very hard to track. Even some of those decisions that are not even, that are not visible, it can be hard to track. And so it's just kind of, um, and sometimes those decisions are instinctive. And I say
Mm-hmm.
instinctive because based on experience. And this is where sometimes we have to, you know, kind of, you know, disrupt that sometimes for teachers, you know, in terms of thinking about instincts and thinking about, really thinking about the curriculum and how that intersects with kids thinking, um, and,
Mm-hmm.
and being intentional and purposeful. And
Mm-hmm.
so oftentimes when I'm working with a pre-service teacher or novice teachers, you know, rather than trying to give them all of these things to work on, one of the first things I try to do, let's just slow down. Let's slow down. I mean, and when I say slow down, it's, you know, you don't have to have all of this stuff going on right now. What is it? You know, let's, you know, so I want them to slow down their processing, because they can then more be intentional about how they're going to think about the work that they're doing with their students. And in planning the mathematics that they want to learn, they want to teach and they want students to learn. And so it is, when I say slow down, my intent is to get them to really think deeper and be more intentional about the space that they're doing. Because I do think there's a level of anxiety. That's the only word that's coming to me right now. One, to do content coverage. I got all this stuff I got to teach. Right. You know, so a way of thinking about that is and I get the pressures of high stakes testing. I get all of that. But is a way to think about how content is connected and how you can get some depth and then figure out, and then how that depth affords you increased opportunity that you still can cover the content, but it is the depth of the content that students will know and understand. And I think
I think about that so much right now because it does feel like everyone is kind of a first year teacher again in the distance context. Like we're all back in that space. And so that idea of how do we slow down and be intentional about the most important work, I think is probably more relevant than ever.
And I think this time is, you know, and then even as we move forward into the future, I think we're going to have to really think about what are the big ideas. We can't, you know, and the other thing is, you know, if we are continuing this in a remote space, to replicate face-to-face, no, it's different teaching. It's disruptive to your pedagogy. It is a different modality of teaching. So to try to replicate face-to-face in a Zoom setting or online may not afford you the opportunities that you hope that would happen in working with your students. And so it requires thinking very differently in the use of technology, intentional use of technology, and using things that you are comfortable with, but also that's going to push you and your students to think about mathematics in very deep ways.
In deep ways.
And not cover a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
So what are the big ideas?
Well, if you have time, because I know we're a bit over, I do have one last question.
Okay.
So my last question is, we are hearing some debate about the idea of remediation in particular. Do I meet kids where they are, or do I start with my grade level content? Any perspective you have from your experience and research on that question?
Great question. NCTM had worked with NCSM, the National Council of Supervisors of Mathematics, and we've had discussions along those lines about that. And one of the things that we've discussed is so students have to learn grade level mathematics, you know, and as we move into this future, they're going to have to, but we also have to figure out what are the big ideas that may have not yet been learned, and then how do those ideas connect to the grade level mathematics that they're going to be learning. So if I'm a fifth grader and there might be some unfinished work that I didn't cover in the fourth grade, how does that connect to the fifth grade curriculum? I'm still doing fifth grade curriculum, but you know, this is where support for teacher comes into play. How do I now acknowledge that fourth grade work that is connected to the fifth grade thing, parts of the curriculum that they have to learn, and make those coverage. I would not be supportive of, okay, let's just teach the last 9 weeks of fourth grade and then start fifth grade in the new year. I think we have to be intentional about thinking about what are those things, you know, and it's going to be hard to cover all those things. I mean, so we have to elevate the big ideas that students need to know and understand, and then connect those big ideas to the things that they're going to learn in fifth grade, if I'm using those two grade levels as an example. So I would not advise starting the school year off with large scale testing. I think we have to be purposeful with formative assessment. and use a formative assessment. So this is where I think some additional supports might have to come in play for teachers. You know, what are some, you know, effective formative assessment techniques and strategies that we can use to support students' thinking?
Which really comes right back to notice and wonder, and
exactly.
understanding different representations of mathematical
Because what happens is when we do large scale assessments or high stakes testing or some type of large scale assessment at the beginning of the year, we lose instruction. We even lose more instructional time.
Right.
And so, you know, if we take a position on formative assessment, we can maximize the instructional opportunities and, you know, respect teachers as professionals to know and understand what students need to, where the unfinished learning was, and then try to connect that. And so I want to position respecting teachers as professionals to use formative assessment strategies, and then in connecting those unfinished things to the thing that they have to learn on grade level. To not create more unfinished learning
by just continuing.
Just continuing.
Thank you. So helpful. I really enjoyed our conversation. Thank you for joining our Rethinking Intervention series. And we look forward to watching what NCTM and produces. We've been so grateful for the 100 days of learning that you all have provided this year, and excited to continue to learn together.
All right. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate you having me. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Dr.